Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I'm going to talk to you all about running cadence. Talk about how to assess it, how to manipulate it, and also a bit about the very popular 180 rule. Now, running cadence is actually quite a simple thing to define. Cadence is the total number of running steps per minute, also called step rate or stride frequency, but cadence is the term that you often hear runners using. And it's also relatively straightforward to assess. So what you do is you watch your runner running and you count the number of footfalls of one leg in a minute, and you just multiply that number by 2. Now, obviously that's quite easy to do on a treadmill, and if you're doing it on the treadmill, I'd recommend making a note of speed, because as we'll talk about later in this video, that our cadence does tend to change with speed, so you want to make a note of what speed you're assessing the runner at. It's a little bit more difficult off the treadmill, so if you're doing an overground gait analysis, and it's a good idea to do both, to look at people both on and off the treadmill. So if they're on the treadmill, just count the footfalls in a minute for one leg and multiply by 2. If they're off the treadmill, you might find using a bit of your technology will actually help. So you can use something like their GPS watch, which you can use to monitor their cadence for a lot of these newer watches. You can also have a look at some of their previous training data, which will give you a good idea of their cadence in the wild, so to speak. And there's things like Run Cadence, which is a great app which you can run with holding your phone for a minute or two, and it'll actually work out that person's cadence. So that's quite a simple thing that you can do during that overground assessment to give yourself a good idea of their starting point in terms of cadence. So it's fairly straightforward to actually assess it. You can use that technology to help. The next step is to think, well, when am I actually going to want to change this? And an important point I want to get in really early with this video is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach with cadence and running. It's not a question of pushing everybody up and increasing everybody's step rate, or all of us aiming for the same kind of magic point. There needs to be a reasoning process, and our change in cadence or step rate needs to link back to a specific goal in terms of injury rehab, or possibly in terms of performance. Now, this is quite a complex topic, so we talk all about this in module 3 in Running Repairs Online. We've got a whole module devoted to gait analysis and retraining with loads of videos and examples and things in there if you're interested to find out more. One example where we might think an increase in cadence would be helpful for a runner is if someone presents to us with perhaps some patellofemoral pain and they're tending to overstride, as we see in this graphic here. So here we've got your kind of classic overstriding picture, someone landing out in front of their body on a fairly straight knee with quite a lot of ankle dorsiflexion. Now, if we see this running gait pattern, we think it increases the stress on the patellofemoral joint, so it could be relevant to this person's pain, and that's where we might think this would be useful. It's got to come back to some relevance to that individual and their goals of perhaps addressing pain. We've also got to think where their starting point is in terms of step rate. So if this runner is running like this and they have a low step rate to start with, typically maybe 175 steps per minute or less, they're going to do better with a step rate increase than someone who's already over 175. Increasing them further can lead to a bit of a shuffly running gait, and we'll have a look at an example of that later. So they're coming in with a bit of patellofemoral pain, they're overstriding, they've got a low step rate. This is someone who may be a candidate for an increase in step rate, and it might be something you could try and see if it actually influences symptoms. Now, there's evidence to support that. We've got some recent research from Chris Brammertool that found that even just one session where someone's shown how to increase their step rate using a metronome and using their GPS watch for feedback can be effective in reducing patellofemoral pain. There's a number of studies too showing that an increase in step rate can reduce patellofemoral joint stress. So you could see how there would be some support for using it in a runner with that presentation. So if we've assessed it, we think it might be relevant to this person, how do we change it? Well, it comes down to the starting point first of all. So we're going to make an increase in that step rate, typically of 5 to 10% based on their preferred cadence where they're starting with. Now it seems to me a lot of runners I see in clinic, their preferred cadence might be somewhere around 160, these people that we're seeing with pain. So we might start with a 5% increase, which would be adding 8 steps per minute, and see how that feels. And we might nudge that up to a 7.5% or 10% increase, depending on the effects we're getting and how it feels for them. Now that range of 5 to 10% increase in cadence has been chosen because there's evidence to show it can reduce the stress on the knee and a number of other tissues without having detrimental effects for running economy. So we're not going to go for a massive cadence increase because that may well actually have detrimental effects for performance, but also we know with running injury it's often associated with big changes. So if we're suddenly making a big change like that, it might upset the apple cart and irritate something elsewhere. So if we want to make that increase of 5 to 10%, we can use something like a metronome app, and this is one called Metro Timer. There's a lot of them out there, and you can set it to your desired beats per minute to match your step rate. So let's say in this runner we've said let's aim for 170 based on their initial assessment, and we would simply set this up to beep and ask the runner to run to the beat. And it's very simple. It's an external cue that a lot of runners will find they can slot into really easily. And then of course when in the first session we're doing this, we've videoed their gait before, we're going to video them using the cues, and we're going to try and provide feedback. Very important when you're using cues to provide feedback. If you want people to make further changes, you can talk them through what to do, you can give them mirror feedback, or you can set up a video so they can see the influence of these gait changes. So a metronome like this, really good starting point. They can then go out and use that metronome themselves out on the roads or on the treadmill. One thing to be a bit aware of is that as we increase step rate, we have a tendency to accelerate. So that's where using it on a treadmill initially is quite useful because you can keep the speed pretty stable whilst you increase the step rate. When you come off the treadmill, you have to keep an eye on the speed so you're not just running faster to achieve those step rate goals. So metronome, good place to start. You can also use your GPS watches. Now you can set up your GPS watch so that it has cadence as a field in your sort of training fields here, so you can monitor it as you go. And this is really useful because we want to be able to provide runners with some feedback as to whether they're implementing these cues. So maybe they use a metronome, but they also use their GPS watch to actually track to see, are they increasing their step rate during these runs? Does it have an influence on the average step rate at the end if they have a look back through some of their training data? These GPS watches are also quite useful because you can set them up to alert if people's step rate or cadence falls below the desired target. So let's say we're working with that runner, we've said 170 was the kind of minimum we wanted. We set the watch to beep if they drop below that 170, and they can use that as a bit of an impetus to up their cadence. And there's an app out there, we've mentioned Run Cadence, that does something very similar. You set it up and then it will beep, but only bring in that metronome if a runner's step rate has dropped below the desired target. So if they haven't got a snazzy GPS watch, perhaps they could use their smartphone with an app like Run Cadence as a way to implement it. Also, some of the newer GPS watches also have metronomes built within them, which will beep for you if you want to. I have found these a little bit hit and miss as to whether they actually beep at the required frequency and work with the GPS, etc. But it's worth looking to see if a runner's watch actually has a metronome within it, because then they hopefully can get all that they need from their particular GPS watch. So, few thoughts so far then. Quite simple to assess running gait. We can manipulate it if we're looking at small changes, increases of perhaps 5 to 10% using a metronome, perhaps supported with the GPS watch to give that feedback that's really valuable. But it does need to be based on individual need and a reasoning process behind it. Now, the final thought here then is, what about this 180 rule? Now, if you're into running and you follow running circles, you'll know for a long time a lot of people have been encouraged to push their step rate to 180. It seems to be this magic number a lot of runners aim for. But it is a bit of a myth. There's very little evidence to support running with a step rate of 180. And one thing to be aware of is that our cadence changes with speed. As we run faster, the cadence increases, particularly as we get up to higher speeds and sprinting, it's really going to increase. So the idea of running with a step rate of 180 all the time doesn't really make sense. It's like suggesting that you drive everywhere in third gear. And especially when you consider every runner will have different builds, different goals, different performance levels, they'll train at different speeds. To create one number that everybody aims for really, to my mind, doesn't make a great deal of sense. It's also not going to be the case that everyone needs to increase. And some people, if they push towards 180, it will be a really significant increase, and it can create problems. It can make things significantly worse. And I'm going to show you an example of this now. So this is a runner who wasn't injured, didn't have any issues, and someone advised him that he should aim for this 180 step rate. Now his self-selected step rate was closer to 160, so it's a big increase from 160 to 180. And actually what you can see in this clip here, this still from the video, he's increased his cadence so much that it's reduced his stride length to a point where he has no flight time. As he pushes off on his right leg, he's immediately about to land on his left. And this is the problem. As you increase cadence, it reduces stride length, and that has some uses, addresses overstriding potentially. But if you increase it too much, you lose stride length, you lose flight time, and that can have a negative impact on performance. You're also likely, if you're increasing it a lot, to increase the number of loading cycles significantly. The amount of steps we're taking in a minute is going to increase, and you might find you reach a point where, because you've increased those loading cycles so significantly, that the cumulative load, if you added up the load per minute or per mile, is now significantly higher. So as with pretty much everything in running injury management, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. There has to be a reasoning process. We have to think about how it's going to achieve someone's goals. We have to test it and see if it has the effects that we want it to. Does it help their pain? Does it change the movement pattern that we see? How does it feel in terms of comfort? And we have to think about how it slots into the rest of the bigger picture. And I would say, well, gait retraining and cadence manipulation is useful. We want to get the load management in there first, the education, the recovery, the strength and conditioning as a priority, because there's actually surprisingly little evidence in a number of conditions to show that gait retraining changes pain. We've got a growing amount in patellofemoral pain, but much less in things like tendinopathy and bone stress injury. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of cadence, how to assess it and change it, and hopefully you can see from that 180 rule is not something that we all need to be following. If you'd like to find out more about running injury management, be sure to visit our running resources page. I'll put the link there in the title and also in our Instagram bio as well. We've got a selection of great free webinars there, and I look forward to reading your questions and things afterwards.